Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Do you have
Can
any
I go ahead and
particular?
ask a question or?
Yes, if you have a specific question, or if you just would like us to give you an overview of the text changes, we can, it's however
Well,
you'd
the
like.
overview will probably help me quite a bit because my main concern right now is I live in a suburb. My house has a little more space than you've laid out in your charts. Um, I'm a little concerned about what happens if my house is bought and basically they knock down the house and what they can put on my lot in a residential area.
Hmm. Okay. Um, so that is likely something that could change through probably most likely the TC 520 text change missing middle reforms. And so what that does is it modifies the way that we measure density currently, which is in units per acre, dwelling units per acre. And it basically flips that measurement to say that the measure of density will be lot area per unit. And the reason that makes a difference is that the way the zoning code works currently is that the minimum lot size for each of the districts, so for example, residential 6, the density there is a maximum of 6 units per acre. The minimum lot size is 6,000 square feet. And so if you do a little bit of math, you can tell that the minimum lot size is actually a slightly less than simply dividing an acre by 6. And the reason for that is the way the code is written now is with the expectation of subdivisions on large undeveloped sites where there are going to be requirements for public streets to be laid out, potentially common areas in a new neighborhood, and environmental features like streams, where you may not actually be able to get the full density if the minimum lot size was set exactly at the acreage divided by the density. And so there's some flexibility built into those minimum lot sizes. But what that does is it basically creates a different standard for those new subdivisions versus an existing lot in an existing subdivision or a developed part of the city, where basically those two situations are not really treated equally by the way the code is written right now. So if the minimum lot size says 6,000 square feet and you have a 14,000 square foot lot, you might think to yourself, well, that suggests that I should be able to subdivide my lot, assuming the other, the width and the depth and those other things are appropriate for subdivision. You might assume, well, I could subdivide into 2 lots and have 2 houses. But because of the density measure of 6 units per acre, a 14,000 square foot lot would not actually be able to produce 2 units because that would exceed 6 units per acre. And so in that sense, a large undeveloped site, it has a benefit that a existing lot does not. And so basically what this TC 520 is doing is reconciling that and basically creating an even standard across those different development types. And then there are some areas where it is allowing new building types and some additional density in districts where it would not have been allowed before. And I think the most obvious and primary example of that is townhouses in the residential 6 zoning. So those are not allowed currently unless you have what's called a conservation development, which is a very large, I believe the minimum size is 10 acres, and you have to set aside a large area of open space, or basically natural area. That is currently the only way to have townhouses in an R6 district, and those townhouses can only actually be a portion of your total units that you develop. In the proposed TC 520, townhouse units would be allowed in residential 6 just in general, for basically any development where the other dimensional standards can be met. So that is a change. Now, the other thing I'll note about that is before our current zoning code, which is called the Unified Development Ordinance, the previous zoning code that the city of Raleigh had prior to 2013 did allow townhouses in residential 6. And that's why you will see in many parts of the city existing townhouse developments in areas that are zoned R6. So I think there's precedent in the city of Raleigh that townhouses are not inappropriate or incompatible with residential 6 zoning. In fact, there's many in existence today that, so far as we can tell, are not really disrupting the development pattern, and people seem to be happily living in them. So really what we're proposing is just more of an even treatment of different development types, and then a little bit of increased density across the residential districts.
So coming back to what you said, if I'm living in an R1 or an R2 subdivision, can an R6 townhouse be built on an empty lot in a residential area? Or does it take rezoning?
If it's residential 1 or residential 2?
Yes.
No, those two districts do not allow the townhouse building type. The only building type.
I wish you'd make it clearer than in the text change text.
In
the tables are very confusing.
So I think what you might be referring to is the conservation development option that I was talking about earlier, which does allow a portion of units to be townhouses if it's in a large development that has a large area of open space. That is allowed in residential 4. And let me just make sure, and if Justin or Keegan know the answer more quickly offhand.
Yeah, sorry, I was looking for the raise my hand feature and I didn't see it. But yeah, John did a great job of explaining that. I think to your question, the conservation development option would be the only option where a townhouse could be built in the R2 district. They could not be built in R1 at any time. And as John said, to do the conservation development, that requires a significant amount of open space to be provided as part of the development. And I'm checking now, but I believe that, yes, in that development in an R2 zoning, only 50% of the units could be townhouses as well.
And just to add on to that, this is Keegan, 40% or 4 acres would have to be set aside as open space that meets specific criteria outlined in the code with that conservation development option.
Okay, so I'd like to see if other folks have questions. Thank you, Mr. Helfand. And if we have time, we'll certainly open up, come back to you if you have more questions. Sure. This meeting, the way it's set up, is everyone has the ability to unmute themselves. I think what would be helpful is if folks would like to be recognized, if you could please use the chat feature and send a message in the chat to let us know that you have a question, and then we'll go through those in order and we'll recognize people. And if you're looking for the chat feature at the bottom of your window, you can see a button that says More and has 3 dots above it. If you click that More button, there's an option there for the chat feature.
John, there's a question about who is representing planning in this meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. We did get started a little bit early just because there were some folks that dropped in early. But yes, that's an excellent point. So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is John Anagnost. I work in the Planning and Development Department at the City of Raleigh. And this meeting is called Ask a Planner. And it's for 2 text changes that are currently pending. One is called TC-5-20, Missing Middle Reforms. And the other is called TC-17-20, Transit Overlay Districts. And so we are here for 2 hours this evening to answer questions that you might have about either of those 2 text changes and how they could impact development in Raleigh in the future. And also from Planning and Development is Justin Rometta, Keegan McDonald, Hannah Reckow, And Katie Dombrowski is our technical supervisor for the meeting, but she's also from the city, just so you're aware. So I see
Do you guys want to call on people, or how do you
Yes,
want to?
I'm seeing some questions in the chat, so I'm going to go through those. I see a question about where can we find a plain language description of the changes. And so there are 2 frequently asked questions pages, one for each of these text changes that are on the city website. So if you go to the city website, raleighnc.gov, and search, I believe they should be pretty easy to search either through the case number, TC-5-20 or TC-17-20, or the title. And
I've also dropped them in the chat, John.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And so those are basically, as I said, frequently asked questions. So it's kind of responses to prompts that we've written that are basically more of a layperson explanation of what these text changes are proposing. I have Joseph Huberman has a question about Western Boulevard. So Mr. Huberman, would you like to unmute yourself?
So John, I had I think some of us had hands up first. I don't think
I'm
this
sorry.
system's going very well, but just, I see the questions in the chat anyway. Maybe just for everyone's benefit, could you just give your city council level overview of the 2 text changes? Just explain what they are. That might answer a lot of people's questions.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
So the first one, TC-5-20, is called Missing Middle Reforms. And so the purpose of that text change is to increase the options for housing development in residential districts in Raleigh. And the mechanism for doing that, the main way that that text change is approaching that is by changing the way that we measure density. So the current way that the zoning code measures density in residential districts is by saying there is a maximum density of a certain number of dwelling units per acre. So for example, in a residential 6 district, that maximum is 6 units per acre. Then there is a minimum lot size that's also required in each of the residential districts. And in residential 6, that is 6,000 square feet for a single family house, or as it's called in the code, a detached house. And so what the proposed text change would do is to remove the density maximum, except for the residential 1 district. And then for the other districts, there is no density maximum measured in units per acre. The way density would be controlled is through a measure called lot area per unit, which in a way is basically the reverse of units per acre. But then the lot area per unit is basically set to the minimum lot area, or in some cases slightly denser. And the reason for that is that the way the current code is set up is that it is slightly focused on new development on large tracts of land where there's an expectation that a new subdivision is going to have to provide public streets. It might have amenities. It might have an odd shape or environmental features like streams. And so there's an expectation that even if you have 50 acres of land in a development like that, because of those other constraints, if the minimum lot area was exactly an acre divided by the density number, you actually would not be able to achieve the density that's indicated in the district because so much of the area of the site would be taken up by those other features. And so the minimum lot area in the code as it is today is a little bit smaller than just taking an acre and dividing it by the density. And so what that does is it kind of gives an advantage to those new developments. So if you had an existing lot in a developed part of the city, for example, the example I used previously was if you had a 14,000 square foot lot in a residential 6 zoning, you might look at the minimum lot area in residential 6 and say, well, the minimum lot area is 6,000 square feet. So I feel like I should be able to subdivide my lot into 2 and have 2 houses. But because of the density standard you actually cannot subdivide a 14,000 square foot lot into 2 units in R6 because that would exceed 6 units per acre. So what that's doing is kind of favoring development on brand new sites, and it puts a little bit of a disadvantage on development that's in existing areas, developed areas of the city. And so what one of the primary things that TC 520 is doing is making it the same standard across either of those types of development. And then there are a couple of other changes with TC 520. The primary one I think is probably going to be important to a lot of folks is that townhouse development would be allowed in residential 6. And currently, townhouses are not allowed in residential 6 unless it's as part of a conservation development. And a conservation development means you have a very large piece of land and you are setting aside a significant portion of it as an open space or conservation area. And in return for doing that, you're allowed to have the more intense building types like apartment or townhouse. And so that currently is the only way to have townhouses in residential 6. And even then, the townhouses can only be a portion of the total units in your development. What TC 520 does is says that townhouses are just allowed in general in residential 6. And that the density, again, is controlled by, in the case of townhouses, site area per unit. Because townhouses pretty much always have a community lot or a commonly owned lot that surrounds the home lots. But it essentially provides a density control. There are some other changes. There's a slight density increase by TC 520 over what you could achieve today. But that's the primary features of that one. Before I move to the other text change, I want to ask Keegan or Justin if they want to add any other aspects of TC 520 that they think are important.
No, I think John did a really good job of giving an overview there. Just note that someone asked about R2 in the chat there, and I did put a response in that the biggest change in R2 would that duplexes or attached houses would be permitted under this text change on a minimum lot size of 30,000 square feet.
Thank you. So I'm going to transition to TC-17-20, Transit Overlay Districts. And so that text change is related to the bus rapid transit planning that's been going on in Wake County for about, well, the plan was adopted about 4 years ago. And then there's been some design planning that's been going on for the actual bus rapid transit stations in the last 2 years or so. And so the Wake County Transit Plan proposes 4 bus rapid transit routes coming from downtown Raleigh. One would go north on Capitol Boulevard or along Capitol Boulevard, one east on Newbern Avenue, one south on Wilmington Street, and then to South Saunders to Garner, and one to the west on Western Boulevard to Cary. And so there was a planning process over about the last year and a half called Equitable Development Around Transit that came up with a series of policies for how the city should plan for development and public amenities around those bus rapid transit routes. That the policy recommendations of that plan were adopted by the City Council earlier this year, so they are now part of the city's comprehensive plan. And so one of the recommendations of that plan is that we apply overlay districts around the bus rapid transit routes to foster the kind of development that is supportive of transit ridership, basically to provide the amount of density and active uses that are going to have people around the transit stop, so they'll be riding transit and then have places to go shopping or eat or work or live when they're getting on and off the buses. So the city has a transit overlay district already in our zoning code that was meant to be used for the light rail planning that was done before the bus rapid transit planning. Light rail was not viable for Raleigh, and that planning basically ended over 5 years ago, and the county switched then to focusing on bus rapid transit. So, but we do have a transit overlay district in our code already. And so what we're doing with TC 1720 is proposing to modify the existing district to focus it more on bus rapid transit, and then creating a new overlay district called Transit Overlay District Residential, or TODR. And that one would also be around the bus rapid transit routes, but a little bit farther away from the transit stops. And so I think that's a good point to talk about where the overlay districts are intended to be applied. So they would be applied around those bus rapid transit routes, typically about a quarter mile to a half mile from the routes. So that's really where the impact would be. And at this point, that mapping process has not begun. We're waiting for this text change to get through the city council review and to see how that turns out. And then we will move to, if it is approved, move to a mapping process later this year. And so to get into what the districts actually do, the first one, the Transit Overlay District, I think the key feature of that is that it offers a density bonus. So in the city's mixed use districts, so for example, office mixed use or commercial mixed use, which is the commercial districts that are typically on all your major streets, Newbern, Western, those are going to have those mixed use districts usually alongside them. So in those districts, there is a maximum height that is specified in the district. And there are several designations. It could be 3 stories, 4 stories, 5, 7, 12, and then downtown it goes up to 20 and 40. And so what the Transit Overlay District says is that in those mixed use districts, you can have additional height beyond what your district says you could have in return for providing things that are considered beneficial, both just in general and for transit ridership. And the 2 things that you can include in your development to get those density bonuses are affordable housing, or if the development is fully for employment uses. So basically an office building or an office building with retail on the first floor. And the height bonus for the affordable housing is 50%. For the employment uses, I believe it's 30%. It's about a third. And so to get into the affordable housing aspect, I want to make sure I'm getting the details right. What the height bonus says is that you can increase your height by 50% if the housing units within that additional height are affordable for households that earn 50% of the area median income or less for a period of 30 years. So, and to give you a sense of what that means, area median income for our metropolitan area is, I believe, in the upper 60,000s. I think it's about $67,000. So I think that's for a family of 4. So a family of 4 earning a household income of somewhere in the range of $34,000 would be able to afford those affordable units that are required to get that density bonus in the TOD. The other thing that the TOD district does is that if it is mapped on a residential district, the development standards in that residential district are replaced with the residential mixed use development standards. Residential mixed use is a mixed use district that allows all the building types, apartment, townhouse, duplex, and single family, and has a 3-story maximum height is how it is posed in the text change. And then the typical density that you can see from that type of district is around 20 units per acre. And so, and the places where we envision the TOD being mapped on a residential district is there are some places where residential districts are directly adjacent to the street on some of these bus rapid transit corridors. And so that's really the only place we're looking at. And also, when we get to the mapping part, we'll probably try to focus that not just on residential districts directly adjacent to the bus rapid transit routes, but large sites that are residentially zoned along the bus rapid transit route. So probably not going to be mapping that on existing subdivisions that have existing home lots. But if there is, say, an acre lot, a 2-acre lot that's zoned residential 10 or residential 6, that would be the type of place where you say it might be appropriate to map the TOD. So those are the main components of the TOD. The TODR is meant to be mapped on residential districts further away from the bus rapid transit routes. Excuse me one moment. So in most of these routes, there are mixed-use districts directly adjacent to the roadway. That's where we would look to be mapping the TOD. And then behind those mixed-use districts, within that quarter to half-mile walking distance, we would say, are there neighborhoods where we can map the TODR, where it would be beneficial for there to be potentially additional density where people can walk to the bus rapid transit. And so the way that the TODR works is it basically takes those lot area per unit measures from the missing middle text change. So these fit together quite well, and we develop them in sync with each other. And it basically increases the density slightly from what's in the missing middle text change. And so the minimum lot area per unit is a little bit lower in the TODR than it would be in the district that the TODR is mapped on top of. So for example, let me use a specific example. So in residential 10, the minimum lot area per unit would be 2,500 square feet. In the missing middle text change, the minimum lot area per unit is 4,000 square feet. So you can see that in the TODR, you could achieve a bit more density than in what the missing middle proposes. Now, obviously, one of the concerns that we've heard over the last few years for neighborhoods that are seeing infill development is that new houses tend to replace one single-family house with another single-family house that is larger. And so it's basically keeping the same number of housing units, but the new units are more costly. And so the way that we're trying to address that with the TODR is by creating a standard called floor area ratio, or applying a floor area ratio. And that's a maximum standard. And so what that means is the floor area ratio is the area of developed space inside the building divided by the area of the lot. And both of those are in square feet. So if I have a 4,000 square foot lot and I have a 1,000 square foot house, my floor area ratio is 0.25, 25%. So what the TODR does is it says there will be a maximum floor area ratio that is set for single family houses very closely to what you could achieve with about a 2-story house with the existing setbacks. And so what that is in, for example, residential 6 with the TODR, the maximum floor area ratio for a single family house would be 0.55 or 55%. So if I had a 10,000 square foot lot, the maximum single family house size that I could build would be 5,500 square feet, which is a large house. That is, I won't argue that. But the thing that we're doing with the floor area ratio is that the more units there are on a lot, the larger the floor area ratio maximum is. So for that same 10,000 square foot lot, if I have a second unit, the maximum floor area ratio goes up to 0.6. And so what we're doing is, number one, limiting the size of a single family house. And number two, allowing a building to be larger if it has more units. And so what we think that will do is it will encourage folks who are thinking about tearing down an existing single family house and building a new structure to say, do I really want to build a really big single family house, or do I want to build a duplex? Do I want to provide additional housing units and increase the supply of housing and still limit the overall size of the building. So that the other benefit there is that that helps to retain some of the detached character that we know is present in the neighborhoods around the bus rapid transit corridors. We know that that's a priority for many folks in Raleigh, that, you know, in addition to the cost of the larger single family houses, they take up more room. They make the neighborhood feel crowded. So that's those two, you know, we think the floor area ratio is really going to help with those concerns that folks have about infill development and help to increase the supply of housing. So those are the main aspects of these two text changes. Now, of course, there are details. I think probably the other thing that is important for a lot of folks is parking. Parking is not required at all in either of these overlay districts. And then aside from those core components, you know, we have some details that we've had to work out. Obviously, anything that you change in the code is going to have spillover effects to other parts of the code. But I think that's a pretty good start to summarizing these. And so then I'd like to return to some question and answer.
John, I see someone at their hand, but you have quite a few questions that also populated in the chat during your overview. So I don't know if you want to hit those first. I'm happy to ask a few if you want to go through them and look at what's there.
I'd like to start with Mr. Huberman, and then let's go to the chat questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Joseph Huberman. I live in Boylan Heights. And I heard that, well, first my question is, when you talk about the distance from the bus transit route, are you talking about the linear route or from the stations? Because walking to where the route is, if the bus isn't going to stop, isn't particularly useful.
That's a good question.
I have another question beyond that. So.
Okay. So the way that we are looking at that is it would be the linear distance, or as the crow flies, from the whole route, not just the station area. And the reason for that is that the stations are supposed to be about a half a mile from each other. So if we go a quarter mile from each station, they are overlapping. And so really a quarter mile from the route is very much, it's virtually the same as a quarter mile from the station.
Okay. Thank you. And then the other question I heard, and sort of what prompted me here, was there was discussion that there was talk about removing the wall between Western Boulevard and Boylan Heights in order to accommodate either a sidewalk or an additional lane for the bus. Is there any planning that's developed along that line at this point?
I am not, I do not have a lot of knowledge of the Western BRT planning process, either the design process or the policy planning process. I would encourage you to visit the city website, raleighnc.gov, and search Western BRT. And I think probably the two Raleigh staff people who would be good to answer that question would be Mila Vega in the Transit Go Raleigh department, and then Danya Sandeep in the Urban Design Center. They are working directly on that Western BRT planning process and would know some of those more specific design details.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Oh, one other thing. What's with the $30,000? Do they have to prove that they had, 30 years? Do they have to prove that they were within a certain level of income for the past 30 years?
I am sorry, I was not clear enough in explaining that. The housing unit has to be affordable at that level of income. The housing unit has to remain affordable for 30 years. The household, I don't think they look back. I think they could just show the last year's tax return really is all they need. It's that the housing unit remains affordable for 30 years. So I apologize for not explaining that better.
Okay. Yeah, that was unclear on in the text that I read on the website as well. It was just like mind-boggling, but that makes a lot more sense what you just said. Thank you.
Okay. So let's look at some chat questions. Katie, are there any common threads that you're seeing that you feel like would be good questions to start with?
Do you have any, there's been a few questions about infill in the missing middle. I don't know if there's any connections or anything you can say about that and how they work together.
The infill compatibility standards, we are not proposing to modify those in the TOD districts. And I don't believe there's a proposal to modify those in the missing middle, but I think Justin and Keegan can answer that better.
Yeah, so there were some changes to the infill regulations last year as part of another text change. These text changes, neither of them do anything to change those rules or make them more or less applicable. You know, when the infill compatibility rules generally deal with street setbacks and sidewall height mainly. And so those rules would remain in effect if an individual lot or site is subject to those standards.
There's a large variety of questions. So I'm just going to go through based on what they were asked. Are the TOD districts form-based?
No, there are no real form requirements in the TOD districts. That kind of thing would be set by if there's an underlying mixed-use district has a frontage. That would impose, I wouldn't even really call it form code. It's really more, it requires the buildings to be close to the street. And then the zoning code has transparency requirements for a couple different building types, the general building and the mixed use building. So there are form-based aspects to the zoning code, but those things are independent of these text changes. And for detached and attached houses, single family and duplexes, state law actually prohibits local governments from regulating architectural features. So unless it's a historic district. So generally, the answer is no. It's not form-based.
Thanks, John. There's a question about, is there data available on BRT ridership, either current or future? I wasn't sure if we had that information or that answer.
So there are no BRT routes that are currently operating. The Newbern Avenue route is the first one that will start, and the projected date, I believe, is 2023 to 2024, when that should be open for riders. And then I think Western is likely to be the next in 2026 to 2027. But no, none of those routes are operating right now, so we do not have ridership data.
Okay, I saw.
John, you could say that Route 15 is, I think, has the route with the highest ridership in the city right now, which is the current Newbern route, if people are wondering about existing ridership.
We do have, fixed route, or the traditional bus service on all of these corridors, and usually multiple routes on each of the BRT corridors. And so that is one of the motivations for the Wake Transit Plan putting the BRT in those locations, is the knowledge that we do have significant transit ridership in those locations already. If you reach out to Go Raleigh, they can provide you with that. They do have to report that annually to the Federal Transit Administration. So yeah, that data is available. I don't have it with me right now, but certainly if you want to get in touch after the meeting, we can find that data.
There were a couple hand raises that came up when you were talking, so I want to call on them before going to the next question in the chat. I believe Michael Lindsay raised his hand first. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, with the proposed text change for allowing higher densities, can you reference an area of Raleigh or a neighborhood that currently has the kind of mix we're visualizing going forward? A single family, predominantly single family neighborhood that has this mix of building types.
Yes, Oakwood, University Park both have a range of single unit, 2 unit, 3 unit, 4 unit. Some of the neighborhoods south of Newbern Avenue, east of downtown, Battery Heights, yeah, basically neighborhoods that are from before 1960s-ish. And so, yeah, it exists.
I was gonna, because I'm looking at the information, and I live in Cameron Park, and you can throw Cameron Park into that list of neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
We've got everything from single family to townhomes to small apartment buildings, et cetera. And quite honestly, I think our neighborhood works well, quite well. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We had another hand raised from Earl Taylor.
Hello.
Hi, Mr. Taylor.
Hey,
What's your question?
I was just asking about the Boylan Heights neighborhood for the Cary BRT. Is that going to get rezoned to RX?
Well, we don't know where we're going to apply the
Just
TOD districts. So I think that's a good question to clarify that what's happening right now, the decision that's going to be before the city council with these text changes is to create these transit overlay districts and to put them in the zoning code. But the current decision by the city council is not to apply them anywhere geographically. There will be a subsequent process after this is approved where we will have community meetings. We will show you maps. There will be planning commission review. There will be city council review. And so it'll be similar to this process, but instead of just talking about the content of the code, we'll talk about where it will be applied.
I got you. So you're saying that at the end of the day, the city council votes on all of this?
That's right. These are city council decisions. Yes.
That's great. Thank you.
Looking at the chat, the next question we had up is Six Forks a TOD? And if so, there seems to be no plan for affordable housing, even though BRT routing is planned.
Mm-hmm. So Six Forks is not in the current Wake Transit Plan as a proposed BRT route. The northern route along Capitol Boulevard, that's in the existing Wake Transit Plan, it goes from downtown to Crabtree Boulevard. So inside of 440. There's pretty much always been an understanding with that northern route that it should continue farther north on 440, or farther north than 440. And so what the next phase of the Wake Transit Plan is likely to do is to ask that question, well, once it goes farther north, where does it go? And so the two main options at this point are Capitol Boulevard and Six Forks. And Go Raleigh and the Capital Area Metropolitan Planning Organization are in the very early stages of a feasibility study that will ask that question with a lot of technical detail. So they're going to hire a consultant, and they're going to basically look at what are the ridership numbers for the current bus routes, what is the type of development that's there, what is the future potential for development, what are the major employers, and then basically think through, does it make sense to have BRT extend on one or the other of those, Capitol Boulevard or Six Forks, or potentially both. And so that study will be taking place over about the next 9 months. And it won't be very public facing because it is a very technical engineering type of study. But certainly the results of that would be public facing once they're under consideration for changes to the Wake Transit Plan. Affordable housing is being considered separately. So these decisions are changes to the zoning code. The Housing and Neighborhoods Department has a consolidated plan for affordable housing in Raleigh that was recently approved by the City Council and talks about how they would spend federal dollars allocated for affordable housing. And there is also the housing bond that was approved on a referendum last year, which I believe was for $80 million, if I'm remembering correctly. And that will be spent on various affordable housing initiatives, including new development as well as assistance for existing residents over the next 5 years. So these text changes don't speak directly to subsidized affordable housing, except for that height bonus in the TOD. But the city does have a separate plan and approach and funding mechanism for affordable housing. And the other thing I'll say about that is state law in North Carolina says that cities cannot force a developer to include affordable housing in a development. No matter how large the development, no matter what kind of development, a city cannot have a zoning rule that says, if you build it, you must have X number of affordable units. We can offer incentives, we can offer bonuses, we cannot make it compulsory.
Thanks, John. There have been a few questions about this, and it's not completely off topic, but it's not directly related to one of the text changes, and that's about where we plan to share, or if we plan to share this recording, and along with the chat, and how we'll be making that available to people.
Actually, Katie, I think you might have a better sense of that than me.
I will need to identify where the best place on our city website is to host this video, and we can also download the chat so people can see the questions that were asked, and we can share that. I will drop a link in the chat to our Planning and Development Department homepage, and on that page, underneath the blue contact box is a subscribe box for planning, news, and events. And we will be sure to send out an email to that planning, news, and events list when this information is available. I don't know that there's a particular project page that we could link this to right now, but we could also make it available on the frequently asked question pages for both of these text change proposals. All right, next question is, are HOA neighborhoods exempt from these changes that benefit no one but the developers?
So homeowners associations or property owners associations, I think the best way to think about that in relation to zoning is that they are pretty much entirely separate from one another. So basically the zoning is a local ordinance that's enforced by the city through review of development plans and through zoning inspections and enforcement. Homeowner association covenants and agreements are private contracts between private individuals and entities that they enforce on each other, essentially through the threat of litigation. The city will not enforce HOA covenants, and HOA covenants cannot violate city zoning. Or in a sense, the city will not approve things and will write someone up for violation, even if their HOA covenants says something is okay. If it violates our rules, we will enforce the zoning rules. So I think maybe what that question is asking is, are there homeowners associations that are going to supersede some of these rules? I think that's very likely. There are existing neighborhoods in Raleigh that have covenants that say what type of development can take place on the lots of the neighborhood, whether they can be rented, other things of that nature. And so, for example, the missing middle text change might say, in your neighborhood, now townhouses are allowed. And somebody in your neighborhood, if they had a large enough piece of property, could even apply to build townhouses. And the city, which this bothers some people, but the city can even approve that proposed development because it follows our rules. But if that person attempts to construct it and it violates the HOA rules in that neighborhood, it is the onus of the other property owners, the other parties to that HOA agreement or covenant, to stop that person from constructing. That's the relationship between those two things.
Thanks for that explanation, John. They had a follow-up question to that, which I think you answered with that description. So thank you. The next question is, where are the transit overlay districts? Did you say you're still working on them?
That's right. So we have not created a proposal for where the transit overlay districts should be mapped. We're waiting for the text change to move through the process. It's premature right now to talk about mapping if we don't know how the actual text change is going to end up. So we are expecting these text change cases to be resolved probably around June or July. And then in August, in September, we would be starting up the public engagement process for the mapping. And it's at that time that we would come forward with where the actual proposed location would be for the TOD district.
Okay, the next question is, can you expand just a little bit upon the definition of what affordable housing is? Because there seems to be a different definition from the city than maybe developers who made up these definitions, and the money associated with the number of people, say 60,000 for a family of 4. Where does that come from, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so the way I'll start with that question is there is subsidized affordable housing and there's market rate affordable housing. So what that means is there is housing where a government or nonprofit agency basically covers some of the cost of the housing, of the maintenance, of the construction, basically artificially reduces the price for the resident so that they can afford it. That's subsidized. So someone else is offsetting your cost to live there. The other form is market rate. And so what that means is in some areas, there are older apartments or townhouses or quadplexes that, because they're a little bit older, are rented for a rate that is also affordable for a household earning similar income to one that would qualify for subsidized affordable housing, but they're not subsidized. They're just offered at a lower rent because of the nature of the product that's being rented. So that's the first distinction I want to make. And so market rate affordable housing doesn't really have a definition. There's not really a formal, you can define it. Subsidized affordable housing, the definitions come from the funding sources. So the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department has money that they offer to local governments that can be used to subsidize affordable housing. And the way that they determine whether housing qualifies for that, there also are tax credits and tax benefits that have the same effect. The way that those incentives or subsidies are granted is through the definitions like the one I described earlier. So Housing and Urban Development, HUD, will say you are eligible for these funding sources or tax benefits if the housing that you're offering is affordable to a household with X number of people whose income is X% of the area median income, and that's what it is. And then in most cases, the local government will adopt those or carry those through to our own programs. And that's largely what our Housing and Neighborhoods Department has done. Our Housing and Neighborhoods Department has largely focused on low-income housing tax credits as the primary way of producing new subsidized affordable housing in Raleigh, because it is the most cost-effective mechanism in terms of cost to the city per unit produced. And what they do is they essentially assist a developer to obtain financing for an apartment. Usually it's apartments. And by providing that additional increment of financing, that can make the difference between that project paying off for that developer or not paying off. And whether or not it pays off is what the developer, how they decide if they're actually going to build it. So that's where those definitions come from. It's basically, you need to meet these criteria to get the economic incentive or the funding.
So just a little sidestep from this, but still a similar topic with affordable housing. Could you just expand upon the part of increasing height in exchange for affordable housing? Is that already approved? Or is it just part of the text change? I think there's people asking for some clarity there.
Mm-hmm. So currently the code does not have any type of height bonus, to my knowledge, of any nature. And so this would be only in the Transit Overlay District, not in the TODR. And what it says is, so let's use an example of a 3-story zoning district. So I have a piece of property in an office mixed-use 3-story district. So my maximum height normally is 3 stories, and that's how much I could build. Once the TOD is applied to that district, it says your height is now increased by 50%, and we're rounding up. So, 50% on top of 3 stories is 4.5 stories. We rounded up to 5. So now you're able to build 5 stories of development in that district. But in those additional 2 stories that you're building, you have to have a third of the units in those stories be affordable to people making 50%, the households making 50% of the area median income, and it has to remain affordable for 30 years. And so when you do the math, what that comes out to for a pretty typical development is that's going to be somewhere about 12 to 13% of the total units in the development would be required to be affordable to get that bonus if it's a purely residential development. So the reason that was the numbers that we selected is we, during the equitable development around transit process, we had a consultant that did some analysis, some real estate market analysis, and basically said that is probably around the percentage where developers could incorporate those units and still manage to turn a profit on that additional height. That if you ask for too many units, that cuts into the profits of the end development, and the developer is going to say, well, yeah, I get extra height, but all the extra profit I get out of that height, you took away because you asked for too many affordable units. So they're just going to say no. No one's going to take that bonus. If it's too few, then we're not getting the benefit of the affordable housing. And so that basically was the kind of sweet spot that the real estate market consultant said is likely to get developers to accept the bonus, and it's going to produce a good number of units. Is that about 12% of the overall units.
Thanks, John. We're going to switch gears here a little bit. The next question just was asking about, other than density, how would the text changes affect walkability? Yeah, that's an excellent question. I didn't really go over that a whole lot when I was originally talking about this. So missing middle is not really going to address that at all. The TOD district makes some changes to the code requirements that we think will help with walkability. So the first thing I'll note there is that there is a provision in the zoning code that says if a developer is rezoning property, and the code would normally say you have to connect these 2 public streets together, or you have to build a new public street in your development, the developer can ask the city council to let them off the hook for that requirement. And the city council can say, yes, you don't have to build that public street any longer. What the TOD says is that exemption is not allowed in the TOD district. If you have a requirement to build a public street and increase the connectivity of the area, you must do it. So that's a first step. The other things that we're requiring is the zoning code has what are called streetscape requirements. What that means is when there's a new development, it has to build the street that it's fronting along and internal public streets to the development
have to be built with certain features like sidewalks, trees, of course, curb and gutter. And so there are different types of streetscapes in the code, and each one has different size of sidewalks or different ways that there is grass incorporated into the sidewalk or features like that. And so there are two streetscape types that are considered the most urban because they have the largest sidewalk area. And those are called Main Street and Mixed Use Street. And so what TOD says is all development must have those streetscapes. You can't have a more suburban style of streetscape. You must have the most urban style of streetscape. So that gives there, first of all, more room for pedestrians. So if there's just a higher volume of pedestrians, that makes that easier, which we do expect there to be a higher volume of pedestrians because there will be people going to the bus stop. And then when there's new business activity along the street, that also increases the opportunities for things like you see around downtown, where businesses can apply for permits to use portions of the sidewalk for outdoor seating. So those kind of things, activating the street, more capacity for people walking, more room for people to walk, that is beneficial as well. The other thing, well, we had originally had some changes to the outdoor amenity requirements. Those have been incorporated into another text change that came along after we developed the TOD text change. But there are some changes to outdoor amenity requirements that we think are going to be beneficial to activating the street. And then the final thing I'll say about that is all development in mixed use districts in the TOD will be required to basically meet the requirements of the urban limited frontage. And so what that means, a frontage means that there cannot, this particular frontage, urban limited, means there cannot be a parking lot between the building and the street. The building has to be close to the street and provide sort of a interesting visual aspect, right? That when a building is closer to the street instead of a parking area, that makes it more comfortable for someone walking, because instead of having to look at vehicles, they're looking at a storefront, they're looking at a restaurant, they're seeing something that's a visual interest. It also makes this a little bit counterintuitive, but by enclosing the street space, it does make it more comfortable for pedestrians by making it feel like it's not this vast expanse that you're having to walk through, but that you're in what is sometimes called an outdoor room in the planning world. So those are all benefits. Hannah Reckow is also pretty knowledgeable about this. I don't know if I'm forgetting any of the aspects. She might have something to add.
No, I think I heard you say everything I was thinking of as well.
Earl, I may need you to step back up to the mic and provide a little more context. I think you asked this question during an earlier part of the conversation about tear downs. You're muted right now. Earl, you're muted, sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm trying.
No worries.
Yeah, so you were talking about that you're encouraging tear downs?
No.
How I read it.
So
you want people to tear down their house so they can build two houses.
the zoning code does not really encourage any type of development other than that affordable housing density bonus.
But you're a planner and you said that.
What I said,
code is neutral. I agree.
Mm-hmm. What I said was, if someone is considering demolishing an existing house, under the current code, in many cases, their only option in that situation is to build another single-family house. And so because of the real estate market dynamics that are present in Raleigh today, specifically high demand and low supply, and specifically for detached housing, when someone makes that decision of, I think I can get more value out of my property by tearing down this existing single-family house, if the only option is another single-family house, then what the market will encourage them to do, because of the demand for that type of house, is to build the largest single-family house that they possibly can.
Yeah, but
So
that's the
what-
market. I'm talking about people's houses. So,
Right. So what we're
what about ADUs? That has been a kind of like a in between thing. So it's like I could build an ADU and not have to build two a duplex. So the ADUs is already kind of like blanketing this whatever you're trying to do, make things dense. So I think that's already in place now, and that took a while to happen, man. Sorry, yeah. So
Yes, accessory dwelling units are now legal by right
yeah,
in all residential districts in Raleigh. So I think when it comes to housing supply, housing diversity, and alleviating the demand that's driving up the cost of housing in Raleigh, I think what's been communicated to staff by the city council is that city council would like to take an all of the above approach. And so when it comes to drafting these text changes, staff works out the details, but the direction of how the text change should modify our zoning code comes from the city council. And so this is what we have been directed to do. And we are providing the city council with what we think fulfills what they have expressed as the political values that they have been voted into office to further. Staff has to respond to that. That's our job. So this is the product that we have created. It is now under public review, or soon will be, at the Planning Commission and City Council. If you feel like this is the wrong direction for our zoning code, I encourage you to communicate that to the Planning Commission and the City Council.
Hey, John, I just want to step in. Could you, because there were some questions about this, and I think this is a perfect time for that. Can you explain the process of how these things move through and what happens after things are in the engagement portal, what the options are for people to maybe submit their comments or participate in the Planning Commission meetings from here?
Yes. So TC-5-20 is actually, if Justin or Keegan wants to talk about the timing there, I think that is going to be going to the Planning Commission first. Is that correct?
You froze a little bit on
I'm
my
sorry.
end.
I
So.
think Justin or Keegan can speak to the timing in terms of when these are going to the Planning Commission a little better than I can.
Yeah, so any text change goes through a process where it's drafted, we put it out for public comment, and they go through a public process with the Planning Commission, who makes a recommendation on the text change, ultimately to City Council, who's the decision maker, as John noted earlier. All of these, or both of these text changes have been referred to the Planning Commission's text change committee, who does kind of the Planning Commission's detailed work in hammering out what their recommendation is going to be on these. TC-5-20 is on their agenda for Tuesday, next Tuesday, the 20th. That agenda has been published on our website, and you can see the information there at 4 p.m. The TC-17-20 is on the agenda as an item that's been referred to them, but won't be discussed because of two other text changes that are ahead of it in the queue. So over the next month to two, these will be deliberated by the Planning Commission and or their text change committee. Ultimately, the Planning Commission will make a recommendation, and then the City Council will hold a public hearing on those. If you want to provide feedback on any of these, as John said, while they're still up on the portal, you can put your feedback there, which I think TC-17 is. After they're closed on the portal, you can email feedback directly to the planning commissioners. That email address we can probably put in the chat, but is on the portal webpage as well. And certainly you can follow the public hearings and sign up to participate and speak in any of those as well. And we can probably put links to all those things in the chat here.
you. And I'll add one other thing in response to that question, which is both of these text changes, to differing degrees, do provide that property owner with more options for using an existing building instead of tearing it down. So by allowing someone to have a duplex where the current zoning says you can only have a single family house, well, if they have a large enough house to where they could internally subdivide that into 2 units, they could keep the existing house and have an additional unit to where they could live in one and rent the other, or build an ADU in some cases, and then live in one of the 3 units and rent the other 2. So that kind of flexibility and additional options, again, it's increasing the supply and diversity of housing while giving existing property owners more choice in what they want to do with their property.
I saw Larry raise his hand, so I wanted to have him step up to the mic before continuing through the chat.
Okay, yeah.
Larry, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I just wanted to circle back to the conversation we had before 5 o'clock, because apparently some of the people came in later and didn't hear it.
Sure.
I was confused because I was concerned that townhouse application could be applied to teardowns and empty lots within R1 and R2s, and you verified, first of all, that that can't be, that the townhouse application is only R4 and greater. So I thought you might want to verify that to the people that are now online. But the second question I had was, it seems like as lot sizes get smaller, and following your rationale, as buildings get either built into duplexes or more housing options rather than a single house, the setbacks get smaller. So if you take an empty lot and you come back in and you want to, say, put a duplex on that same property, you can be within 10 feet of your side neighbor. You can be within 10 feet of the street. That's going to really be, is going to stick out like a sore thumb, I guess, in established neighborhoods. I can see it in a new neighborhood, but I can't see it happening in an established neighborhood.
Okay, so I'll respond to the first part of that first. So the missing middle text change, TC 520, would allow townhouses in residential 6. I don't believe it allows townhouse in residential 4, if I'm remembering correctly. There is a provision in the zoning code that in a special type of development called conservation development option, where you start with a very large site and you set aside a large portion of that site as a conservation area or open space area. In return for that, you are allowed to have building types that are not otherwise usually allowed. In that situation, in R2 and R4, but not in R1, you could have a portion of the total dwelling units be townhouses. So that is kind of the clarity on those districts that I think, thank you, Larry, for bringing that up. In terms of the setbacks, so yes, in some cases in the missing middle text changes, the existing setbacks will get slightly smaller. One of the things that we wanted to accomplish is that basically the setbacks are more uniform across building types. And the reason for that is that I want to refer back to the name of the text, missing middle. What missing middle means is that in many cities in the United States, there was a decisions made across virtually the entire country after World War II that cities would be divided, and there would be one area where there would only be single family houses, and there would be other areas where there would be multifamily development and commercial development, and those two things would not mix. And to be frank, that was based on racism. In almost every case was racist. And we're seeing the repercussions of that today. And people were kept out of economic opportunity because of those decisions. So we have work to do to make that better. And part of the way we can do that is by not encouraging, but allowing there to be a middle ground, a missing middle, those types of housing development that are in between single family and a 5-story apartment block. That's what we want to allow once again. And, we talked earlier in this meeting about those neighborhoods from before the 1960s, University Park, Cameron Park, Oakwood, Battery Heights, where these different types of development were common, and nobody said, this is ruining my neighborhood. People just lived there. And so I think what you're seeing is, yes, some of the setbacks will get smaller, but the setbacks will be more uniform across the building types. And so what that does, it basically is saying, it's raising a question. If you can't tell the difference between a duplex and a single family house other than the number of doors on the front of the building, why is it important to you that there's a duplex in your neighborhood?
Michael, did you have a comment or question you wanted to add to this? I saw you raise your hand.
Yeah, I was away for a minute and I heard the tail end of that. The question I wanted to ask, first of all, what you said there I thought was interesting. In Cameron Park, we have plenty of duplexes that you can't tell because the multiple doors are on the interior, not the exterior. There's only one door on the exterior. My question would be, this kind of missing middle that exists in Cameron Park, exists in University Park, et cetera, we're all pretty much a grid of streets. What I'd like to understand is there are a ton of suburban cul-de-sac neighborhoods that I think this kind of housing, the missing middle that we're visualizing, could potentially be a disaster because if people were to take advantage of this new zoning rule, they'll build higher density, yet all those cul-de-sacs go out to like one entrance. Have y'all thought about that? I mean, it seems to me like this visualization of what we're talking about works great for where we are. We're a very walkable neighborhood. There are many days we don't get in our cars. But if I lived out in North Raleigh somewhere in a cul-de-sac neighborhood, I don't see what this accomplishes potentially. It seems like it should be appropriate in certain areas, but not others. But this looks like it's holistic and it's across the city, not by area or something. Is that correct?
Yes, so the TC 520 would apply to all residential districts everywhere in Raleigh. And I think you make a good point that many of the neighborhoods built basically from the 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, still today, do not have connected streets. And that was on purpose as much as the single family zoning was on purpose. And so, yeah, I think that is a limitation on this. And it is a legacy of our historical development patterns, again, that we have to live with today and we have to face the consequences of today. And so to a certain extent, we are relying on the market to push those decisions in a particular direction. And then the other thing I would say in response to that is that I think that the missing middle text change is incremental in that sense. So yes, there are different housing types that are allowed, but there still is a control on density. There still is that lot area per unit. So there still is going to be a maximum density, and it's not going to be that much higher than today. It's going to be an incremental increase. So would I say it's going to be a disaster? I wouldn't describe it as that. I would say it's incrementally increasing.
Okay.
Justin, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically what John kind of just said there at the end, but I would just, point out that, there are still different dimensional standards for different housing types and in different zoning districts. And in the areas on the outskirts of town where you have a more suburban context, you're less likely to have an R10 or R6 zoning. You're going to have more R4 zoning. And this text change does not allow, so when we say it allows additional building types, it does So for example, you could put a duplex in R2 or R4 now where you couldn't before, but not on the same size lot that you could put a single family home. So you still need that additional land area to be able to build some of these additional housing types.
Thanks, Justin. John, can you talk about parking, and are there any parallel efforts to revise the parking code or reduce parking requirements? What can you tell us about these text changes in parking?
Katie, I can clarify my question. You're reading my question.
Oh,
If you
sure.
want, just real quick. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah, I was super stoked to see you got rid of minimum parking requirements in the TOD language. At least that's how I read it. So, and I was just wondering if there's any other efforts to maybe take a broader look at the UDO to update the current minimum parking requirements. Like when I was on Planning Commission, I thought they were pretty high, even though we lowered them from what was there before. And it seems like that's still something that, given the other goals we have in the city, particularly related to like climate change, if there's any efforts to take a look at those again.
Yes, the simple answer is yes. So I think what you might be referring to is that there was a text change last year that reduced the parking requirements for residential development types slightly. And that's in effect today. So missing middle text change does not change that. Those would remain as it was adopted last year. TOD removes parking minimums and then applies the maximum of 2 spaces per unit that is also applied in downtown. And then, is there going to be further change to parking requirements? One of the council members at a recent meeting did request that staff start exploring further reducing parking minimums in Raleigh. And so that text change will be in development over the next few months, and you'll probably see, maybe in about 6 months or, less, 3 to 4 months, a text change that proposes reducing some parking minimums.
Thanks, John. There's been a few requests. If you could just expand upon these text changes and their impact on R4. I think you were kind of touching on that in the beginning of the meeting, and some people might have missed that.
Yeah. So let's see. So I'm just going to use a specific example. So in residential 4, today the maximum density is 4 dwelling units per acre. So I'm going to do a little bit of math, but it won't be too crazy. So an acre is 43,560 square feet. So if you divide that by 4, you're just under 11,000 square feet per unit. The minimum lot size in R4 is 10,000 square feet. So the minimum lot size is less than actually dividing an acre by 4. What the missing middle text change does is it says, okay, we're just going to get rid of the 4 units per acre, and we're just going to go with that lot area. We're just going to say the density is set by the lot area per unit. So if you have a 20,000 square foot lot, you can subdivide it into 2 lots, assuming the other dimensional requirements are met, the depth, the width, all those things. And so what that does is it will open up opportunities for more lots that are in those intervening sizes where they're kind of in between that density per, units per acre density and the lot area density. Those will now be able to subdivide when they weren't before, or to have more units in an apartment building, or to have more townhouse units on a site, whatever the zoning, allows. And so in residential 4, that's going to be single family. And so what that ends up doing is it also increases density slightly, right? So the current density in residential 4 of 4 units per acre, as I said before, is about just under an 11,000 square foot lot. If it's a 10,000 square foot lot, that density is going to go up to 4 and a fraction, 4 point, and I'd have to look up, we have some tables that show this, but somewhere between 4 and 5 units per acre. So an incremental increase in density.
Thank you, John. Is there anything in the TOD text change that specifies buildings, particularly commercial buildings, must have the main entrance facing the primary street or bus route? I.e., the entrance can't be in the rear of the building if they decided to put a parking lot there.
This is for the TOD.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So in the TOD, the requirements of the urban limited frontage would apply. And with all of the frontages that we have in our code, there is a requirement that there be a pedestrian entrance that is directly accessible from the street by an ADA accessible pathway. So yeah, the answer is yes. If there's a new development in the TOD, regardless of whether the underlying zoning has a frontage, there will have to be a building entrance facing the street.
Thanks, John. All right, just scrolling through the chat. Can you talk about bike lanes and if there's any included requirements for bike lanes?
So missing middle doesn't speak to that at all because it's just, that's not within the scope of that text change. TOD also does not really speak to that. The way that bicycle lanes are decided is the city has a street plan in our comprehensive plan that designates major streets as particular types of streets. So it'll say this street should be a 4-lane street, this should be a 2-lane street, it should have a median or a center turn lane, those types of things. And so that's where the bike lane requirement comes into play. So these text changes will not be impacting that. Those will be set by whatever the regular zoning is. I can tell you that there is a text change in development in the transportation department to increase the types of, to basically have more of those street types require a protected bicycle lane. So many of them already do require a bicycle lane that's separated from the vehicle lane basically by a painted stripe or a painted separation. And so what this text change that's in development would do is say for many of those street types, it can't just be a painted separation any longer. It has to be a physical barrier. So a raised concrete curb essentially, or small median in between the vehicle lane and the bicycle lane. Some physical separation would be required. And so that is not, that development is not complete yet. So I would expect, I don't know the exact timing on that, but sometime later this year for that to be presented to the Planning Commission for their consideration. And so if that's approved, you know, many of the streets along the bus rapid transit corridors, it would apply to those because they are major streets.
Thank you, John. I've noticed in the chat some of our planning and development staff has been providing some answers and context for some of these questions, which is super helpful. So thank you. Just scrolling the chat here, and feel free to raise your hand as well if you have a comment or question. It doesn't have to go into the chat.
I see a question about how does Chapel Hill require developers to include affordable housing? My understanding is that that is a density bonus. similar to the one that we're proposing. That it's basically the developers offered additional height allowance in return for including those units. If that is a truly inclusionary zoning, it's potentially in conflict with state law. And it may just be that the state is not aware of it.
I'm not sure that I really see too many more questions. I'm seeing a lot of comments and open discussions and back and forth with staff and other comments on growth and change. But I'm not seeing any other questions unless I missed something. So please raise your hand if we did miss your question, or if you have more questions, or, you know, we're here for until 7 to talk to you. Adam, if you want to step up to the mic.
Yeah, just real quick, John. Well, first of all, thanks to the staff for doing this. It's super helpful, and I really appreciate you taking your time. You know, this is your job. You're not elected officials, but I know sometimes you get questions as if you are elected officials. So thank you for responding to all those professionally, like you always do. So I just had a question. You brought up when we were talking about the BRT, and John, I know you've done a lot of work on that Capitol Boulevard planning study. You said that in terms of thinking about BRT on Capitol versus Six Works, you said that would be like a technical consultant type of thing and not very public facing, which of course got my radar antennae going, because I hope there's some public input on, you know, the choices involved, because that's not necessarily a technical solution. Lots of times, like, you know, traditional transportation planners say things are technical in nature when they're actually choices that we decide to make or not, you know. So maybe just assuage my fears on that a little bit, or are they already going to be building off of the plans that we have, or what do you say to that?
So the study that I described, the feasibility study, it's a preliminary technical study. And like I said, it won't be very public facing because there are two factors that I think are pretty critical that is going to try to analyze. That are, what is the likelihood of either of those two routes or both being eligible for federal transit dollars? And so there are criteria that your program, your transit planning has to meet to be eligible for those grants. And so, and that's kind of why, in my understanding, Raleigh moved on from the light rail planning earlier than Durham and Orange County, is because it didn't seem like that those criteria would be met for the federal funding. So part of that feasibility study is just to start thinking about that question. Does it seem likely, based on the ridership and the destinations, that we would qualify? And then the other technical aspect that we want to think about is how much is it likely to cost to build the stations, to acquire the right-of-way, which means buying land from private property owners, and land fronting on commercial corridors that get out tens of thousands of car trips a day is pretty much the most, other than the middle of downtown, is the most expensive land in Raleigh. So we want to think about that too. And so that information would then be used in the public facing process that Wake County and Go Raleigh would do for the next phase of the Wake Transit Plan. So and that would be public facing, just like the 2016 Wake Transit Plan was very public facing. But before you can actually come up with the proposals to ask the public to weigh in on, you don't want to offer proposals that have a low likelihood of being successful. And so that's really the goal there, is to really vet those, make sure that they're at least in the ballpark of feasibility, and then we can go to, okay, we think these are possible. Now, is this what the community wants?
If I can ask one quick follow-up on that. So that all sounds good. I think even though I heard one thing in your description that sounded potentially like a choice and not a technical question, which is in terms of buying commercial parcels, I would think potentially there could be a choice to say, take a travel lane out of Capitol Boulevard instead and turn that into a dedicated bus lane rather than buying a bunch of property along Capitol Boulevard, where that's a choice, maybe not a politically easy choice, but that is a choice that could be made, and certainly would be a lot cheaper than buying a bunch of commercial real estate along Capitol Boulevard. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, that is, I guess, in all possible worlds, that is an option. I think there are some other factors that come into play there, such as the wishes of NCDOT in terms of future capacity for those roadways, if NCDOT has control of them. But yes, I don't know for certain if that is one of the options that feasibility study will take into account. I think considering that Six Forks very recently underwent a pretty extensive corridor study that really did have a lot of conversation about 4 lanes versus 6 lanes. I think it's unlikely that we would repeat that community conversation, that decision, so soon after having done that. And so I don't know. I think if you would like to advocate for that, you can probably get in touch with Go Raleigh staff and say, I think it'd be good to have this included as an option to explore. I don't know for certain that that's how they're looking at it.
Okay, thank you. Who on Go Raleigh would you suggest I contact?
I would say either David Eatman or David Walker.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
I know this is a little off topic, but there was a question about BRT routing and a transfer station that was proposed in the Midtown area plan. Are we aware of that?
My understanding is that transfer station is part of the Wake Transit Plan and is being allocated funding, and that even if it doesn't operate as a bus rapid transit facility, it will serve as a transfer point for traditional bus service, fixed route bus service. So I believe that is going ahead just because of the amount of demand for bus service today in that area and between the 3 or 4 routes that serve that area. So I don't think that's dependent on BRT, but it certainly can be an asset to the BRT program if Six Forks is selected for future route extension.
John, unless somebody raises their hand or thinks another question, I think that concludes what I'm seeing in the chat.
All right, great. We'll just hang out, see if folks have other questions.
We did, a couple of us dropped the link to the citywide Gov Delivery webpage, which is a great place to go and not only sign up for planning news and development news, but BRT news, project specific news, news from other departments in the city. And Justin also at the end of the chat here dropped a link to the Planning Commission if you're interested in contacting them, participating in a public hearing, or the like. Larry just raised his hand. Larry.
Thank you. Since we have a little extra time, I don't want to take away from ongoing conversations, but do you have the time to revisit city notification on rezonings? Is that something that can be addressed right now? My question really is, right now, the notification to the people around rezoning projects, besides the signs going up, is that people within, I think, 500 feet, I think it is, get notified. My question is the city doing that? Is the developer doing that? Who decides on who's getting notified and when they're getting notified?
Mm-hmm. So there's a state law that sets a minimum, which I believe is 100 feet. and and the state law is only for the city council public hearing, if I remember correctly. And so anything we do beyond that is the city's prerogative. And so a couple of years ago, the city, we did used to have it be only 100 feet, and we did it for planning commission and city council. And like 2-3 years ago, it was increased to 500 feet for both planning commission and city council. And then more recently, there was an additional neighborhood meeting that is required. So there was already a neighborhood meeting required before the application was submitted. There's a text change that was approved. That requires another one after the application is submitted and before it goes to the planning commission. And for that meeting, the notice radius is 1,000 feet. And then it's 500 feet for planning commission and city council. The way that works, also there is the signs for tenants or residents of multifamily development. And there is also a requirement that mail notice be provided to residents of multifamily development if those addresses can be identified. Now, sometimes that's difficult because they don't appear on the tax records necessarily. So how does that work functionally? The applicant provides the city staff with the envelopes and with postage and addresses on them. We check to make sure that all the appropriate recipients are in that set of envelopes for all 3 of the meetings after the application is filed. Well, the neighborhood meeting after the application is filed, the applicant can mail that themselves. They can also mail the one from before the application is filed. And basically they provide city staff with the contents of the letter and their list of people are going to mail to. And they have to provide basically photos of the letters, not every single letter, but just showing that they have a set of letters. So that's the way that the applicant does it for the neighborhood meetings. For planning commission and city council, they provide us with the envelopes, postage paid and addressed, and then staff will actually print those letters, put them in the envelopes, and we mail them before those meetings.
So you're saying that the developer identifies the household that they want to notify?
But then they're verified by city staff. So if they're missing any, we will basically tell them you need to add these to your list.
Okay. So when does it go? When it goes from the 500 foot for the first meeting to 1,000 feet for the second meeting, is there a second mailing?
Yep. Yeah, so there's a mailing for the first meeting. They have the meeting, they turn in their application, then there's a staff review period, and then once the staff review period is complete, that's when they're eligible to move to the planning commission. So at that point, you say, well, between the staff review and the planning commission agenda, you need to have another neighborhood meeting. And that's where it goes to 1,000 feet, and they do another mailing to those folks.
Okay, thank you. That clears up a lot. Because I've noticed in the application, there's usually a list of the people who were notified pre-application. So it's also attached. But I question what happened on the second one, which many people just aren't aware even happened. Thank you.
Well, I do want to point out that we have started listing those meeting dates, the neighborhood meeting dates, on the city website. And so we do want to make that more clear when that's occurring. And I think we even, if it's a virtual meeting, I believe we provide the link as well. I'd have to double check the site.
Yes, because I'm definitely interested in that. And there's a lot of interest in knowing when these public meetings occur.
I think that's right, John. The invitation is linked on that page. And I can add that the second neighborhood meeting is required for probably most requests, but there's a series of sort of thresholds that trigger the need for that case. There are a few requests that come in that may not trigger the second neighborhood meeting, but I would say most do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those are things like, is the site larger than 5 acres? Is it rezoning to a height taller than 5 stories? Is it increasing density significantly? Those kind of things, then that's when it's required.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just dropped a link in the chat to the neighborhood meetings webpage on our city website. We're here for another 20 minutes. If anybody has any other questions, they can unmute and ask or raise their hand or put it in the chat. But we're here until 7, and we appreciate all of you who have come and engaged with us. It's been a really good discussion, and we appreciate it. So there was a comment made about next door just now in the chat, and I'd be happy to address that. Right now, the only approved next door accounts for the city of Raleigh are a overall city of Raleigh next door account, which is managed by our city of Raleigh social media manager in the communications department. And the Raleigh Police Department also has a next door account. They are investigating some options for some other departments to have their own next door accounts. But currently that's not an option for us as staff. However, we are partnering more with the city account to try and get information out about planning and development. We've done this a lot for the Dix Edge area study, and it's something that we plan on utilizing more moving forward. It's just not something we have access to as independent staff of the planning and development department. John, could you summarize the Newbern Avenue TOD study?
Yeah. So that story starts with the equitable development around transit study that was happening over about the last 2 years. And so that resulted in some policy recommendations that were adopted by the city council about 2 months ago. And that was in the form of a guidebook called Equitable Transit Oriented Development Guidebook. So that is now adopted city policy, and that one of the recommendations was these overlay districts. And then there's basically a parallel recommendation that says there should be land use planning and other types of planning around the Newbern corridor. And I do want to differentiate, because there are two planning processes going on right now that are both have the title Newbern. So one is Newbern BRT, and that is a design planning process. And what that means is that Go Raleigh is coming up with the actual physical design of the roadway. So how do the lanes have to, and the median and the intersections have to fit together? How do the intersection traffic signals have to work? Where would the actual station footprints go within the street? Those very physical details are part of the Newbern BRT design study that Go Raleigh is doing right now. And so that will result in basically the engineering drawings that will then be used to construct the BRT route. There is a separate process that is being led by the Planning and Development Department that is called Newbern Station Area Planning. And the station area planning process is basically saying, okay, for each of those areas along the corridor where we are planning a BRT station, we want to think about what is the future of development going to look like? How do we make sure that it is as safe to walk as possible, and to basically put much more focus on people walking than on vehicles. and to basically create areas around those BRT stations that are transit areas and not so much a commercial thoroughfare area. That's a lot of what that planning process is going to do, is to say what type of new development should come in, if or what in what form should that be and where, and then how is the city going to improve the street infrastructure so that the new and existing residents and workers have the safest and most comfortable way of getting around without driving a car. And so that Newbern station area planning is just starting up this summer. So we have been reaching out to local members of the community to form basically an advisory group to follow that whole process and to help staff make sure that we are reaching everyone who is affected, to make sure that we're asking the right questions, and to make sure that the ideas that we come up with at the end are reflecting the community's values for the area. So we've been bringing those people together. That's going to be the first part of that. And then there will be basically a fully, open to the whole community, we call it a kickoff, probably in June, I believe, is when we're looking towards that, where we will invite everyone really in this whole city to learn about that process and to see if they want to participate, and then start learning how we're going to move through different community meetings, different design and planning meetings to produce those recommendations.
Thanks, John. We have a UDO question. So can you please explain section 2.3.4.D3 townhouse parking setbacks from side lot line minimum 0 feet or 3 feet? Can you explain with examples?
An example, I don't know if I can try.
Yeah.
You want me to answer that one, John?
I was wondering if Justin might want to.
Yeah, certainly. Go ahead, Justin.
So you'll see that language, that 0 feet or X feet, in a couple of places in the code. And what that means is, if you're in the case of a parking lot or a drive aisle, if there's a shared cross-access easement between two properties and a shared drive aisle along a property line, obviously that setback is going to be 0. It's going to be on the property line. If that's not the case and all the parking is contained on one lot, then it would have to be at least 3 feet from the side property line. So it's an either or scenario.
Thank you. I think that was the explanation that was needed for that question. So we got a thank you in the chat. So I'll take that as a win, Justin. Thanks.
And that's not anything that's not any new language. That's existing language in the code today, and we're not proposing to change it.
All right, well, we're still here until 7 o'clock. Oh, here's another question. Just about to see if there's one. Does that create a 0 lot line scenario for townhouse subdivisions?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's obviously townhouses have 0 lot lines already, right? The shared party wall between two buildings is on the property line. And then the setbacks are to, for the end units to the side property lines. One thing that is changing with this, with TC 520, is that internally to a townhouse development, there is no side setbacks. We're moving more towards a building to building separation. So there's only a requirement that each building be 10 feet from another building. And then there's setbacks around the perimeter of the site as a whole, which, depending on what's adjacent to the development, could include landscaping and a wall or a fence, if the adjacent property is vacant and zoned for residential or already contains single-family residential uses on it. So that is one change here, where we're moving to more of a internal to the development. There's just a building-to-building separation, and then on the outskirts of development, there's perimeter setbacks adjacent to the surrounding properties.
And so a follow-up question to that, Justin, does that building separation vary from one residential district to another to help keep the current building pattern?
The internal separation does not vary between zoning districts. It's always just a flat 10-foot separation between buildings. The perimeter setbacks do vary depending on context of what exists surrounding them. So, for example, in R10, if you're building a townhouse development, you don't have to provide any landscaping or buffering to an adjacent townhouse development. But if you're building a townhouse development in R10 or R6 adjacent to an R4 or R2 zone with single family housing, detached housing, then you'd have to provide a perimeter buffer along that side of the property.
Thank you. All right, guys, well, we're here 10 more minutes. So keep your questions coming, or feel free to unmute and ask a question or drop it in the chat. But we're here until 7. We need some in-between question music.
Hey, I'll break the silence real quick. I just wanted to say thank you guys for taking the time to answer people's questions and be available. The online format is really great for people who can't necessarily travel to an in-person meeting place. So this is a great way to get the word out to people. So thank you for your professionalism and answering questions, and of course, working for the government can mean a lot of, we're facing a lot of anger and misunderstanding, because of course you're handling complex things that you're really well steeped in, the ins and outs of, but I think a lot of people come at it feeling very blindsided because they're not familiar with the inner workings of how these decisions are made. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to getting to go to more of these meetings in the future.
Great. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We've got 7 more minutes if anybody has a question. I meant what I said about the music. But we're here until 7, so if you think of anything while we're here, please go ahead and unmute and speak up, or drop a question in the chat for us.
think I'm seeing the beginning of a question in the chat. And I believe that might be David Smoot. David, if you'd like to unmute, we'd be happy to talk through your question in real time.
Hey, sir, sorry. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Hey, I had my headset turned off and I was typing. My question is, for a compact development in R4, if you had a site that consisted of 3 lots, each lot was 1 acre or less, for the overall site, you would set aside 1 acre for open space. And you go to divide, each lot into, say, townhouses. Would each townhouse lot then fall in that 38% impervious coverage, or would you look at the overall site, including the area that you have set aside as open space? So that, is it okay, of the full 3 acres, you can have 38% impervious? Does that make sense?
You're referring to the impervious cover maximums in chapter 9 in the stormwater section?
Yes.
So, Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those standards are focused on infill development. Do those apply? Because if it's new development, the expectation is you'll provide a stormwater device that will meet the standards in the subsequent section of chapter 9.
Yeah, if you're subdividing, then you're going to be held to the stormwater rules for subdivisions and treating the stormwater that way. Those impervious surface limits are for existing, what are called existing grandfathered lots.
So I think, to, I guess, fully answer the question, there wouldn't be necessarily a percentage impervious cover. It's more the open space requirement. If there's additional primary tree conservation requirement that isn't fulfilled by the open space area, building setbacks, and then whatever, if that's part of the hardscape of the development, just has to be treated for quality and quantity by the size of, has to be an appropriately sized stormwater device. That's really the limitation on the impervious. It's not a numeric percentage.
Okay, I just need to think more about that. Thank you.
Oh, well, that was good timing. John, we only have about a minute left. I didn't know if you just wanted to remind everyone one more time how they can provide their feedback on any of these things, whether it be through the portal or otherwise.
Yeah, I would say visit the city website and search for text change cases, and then you can pretty easily get to the text change cases webpage, which has the most recent, the upcoming meeting for each of these cases will be listed there, and then it will also have the link to the text change portal. And so, you can see whether there's a planning commission meeting coming up, and then go to the planning commission webpage and use that page to sign up to speak if you'd like to speak, or email the planning commission, or use the portal to enter comments. Now the portal's closed for TC5, but it's still open for TC17, I think until tomorrow, right, Katie?
I think so, at minimum. We may have extended it a few days, but definitely open through tomorrow.
Okay.
I'll check the date real quick.
And if you're having trouble, you can always email or call staff, and we will help you find the appropriate way to participate. Well, I think that wraps it up for this evening. Again, thanks to everyone for being here. We hope you continue to participate as much as you'd like to, and we're available in the future to help you with this process. And we hope you have a great evening.